He had not planned to leave the town that morning. The decision came from the kind of whispers that move through frightened crowds when uniforms appear at the end of narrow streets, and the last market stall folds its cloth and disappears. The boy carried no map, no papers, only a small canvas bag tied twice around the straps so it would not swing as he walked. He was 16, though in the days that followed, age stopped being a number and became something measured by how many times he managed to keep moving when others sat down. The road out of the town was not a road in the practical sense. It was more like a strip of dirt that once connected farmsteads and now carried a halting column of civilians. The spring rains had done their work. Puddles collected where the ruts sank deepest, and each step required judgment, mud or stone, stone or grass, always choosing what would keep the shoes from tearing. Around him drifted people who had once been neighbors, but now did not speak to one another. There was nothing to say. Everything had been said on the night the rumors started. Hours passed before the first soldier appeared. He rode a bicycle, the chain squeaking in a rhythm that did not match the uneven breathing of the refugees. He did not stop to speak, only raised a hand, palm open, as if to slow the walking crowd, though they were not moving fast to begin with. Behind him came the rest of the small unit, not marching so much as trying to maintain the appearance of order. One man kept checking a piece of folded paper, staring at it as though it might change if he looked often enough. It did not take much imagination to know what the paper was supposed to represent, or how little it matched the countryside through which they now advanced. The boy watched them pass. He noticed how one man's bootlaces were unevenly tied, how another's rifle strap had been repaired with a mismatched piece of leather, and how none of them bothered to keep their voices low when debating which fork in the path led to the nearest railway. They were not moving towards something, they were moving away. That distinction would matter later, but at the time it was only a feeling, nameless and heavy. Midday the refugees had slowed enough that the boy could hear the distant engines. It was not a sound one mistook for anything else. Trucks had a certain rhythm, an insistence, the way mechanical decisions translated into forward motion even when the drivers themselves were uncertain. The conv came into view between the hedges, 3 vehicles at first, then 2 more, followed by a gap as though someone had forgotten to maintain spacing. The officers barked instructions that carried poorly in the wind. Whatever urgency they felt did not spread to the civilians, who simply stepped aside and created room without being told. The first truck stopped at the bend in the road, where a stone milestone leaned at an angle so shallow it appeared ready to collapse. The officer climbed down and gestured to the locals, demanding direction with the impatience of a man who assumed the countryside obeyed whatever lines had been drawn on his map. Several refugees pointed left, an old man pointed right. The officer scowled, checked the map again, then waved his convoy forward in the direction the old man indicated. As the trucks lurched forward, the boy noticed the map had been folded so many times that parts of the ink had begun to fade. Sections that must have once been forests were now pale smudges. Roads drawn in black were no longer roads at all. No one cheered when the trucks vanished beyond the bend, and no one remarked on the hesitation that had preceded the decision. Yet something lingered in the air, a kind of uncertainty that acted like gravity. The boy kept walking, but his mind remained at the bend. He had grown up in the area and knew the network of tracks that ran between fields and villages. The road the old man had recommended no longer connected to anything, a bridge that had been destroyed the previous winter after the river swelled beyond its banks. Perhaps the soldiers did not know this. Perhaps they would find out soon enough. Evening brought a cold wind that forced the refugees to cluster together for warmth, though it did nothing for the boy's thoughts. He replayed the scene at the bend, the map that failed to represent reality, the conflicting suggestions, the awkward delay. It was not courage that kept the idea alive in his mind. It was curiosity and a quiet recognition that soldiers in retreat could be guided by uncertainty as easily as by orders. The road they feared most was the one they could not confirm. The next morning, as the column resumed its slow march, the boy walked ahead until the crowd thinned enough that he could study the crossroads without interruption. The milestones still leaned. The tracks in the mud told the rest of the story. Tire treads curved toward the broken bridge, and boot prints marked where men had checked the water level before deciding whether the trucks could risk it. They must have turned back eventually. The wheel ruts overlapped in chaotic patterns that spoke of frustration rather than purpose. The boy continued walking, counting the forks, the hedgerows, the livestock paths that fed into the larger route. He was not mapping it in the formal sense. He was remembering how children remember things, with landmarks and sensations rather than coordinates. There was the farmhouse with the rusted plough in the field, the grove where the ground dipped and held rainwater days longer than it should, the ridge from which both the main road and the railway line were visible when the crops were short. He knew these places because they had once formed the boundaries of his world. He did not know that they would soon become boundaries for soldiers, too. By the time they reached the second village, the officers had begun speaking in lower voices, consulting their own maps with a kind of desperation that betrayed their discipline. Paper rustled, compasses clicked against metal, and every few minutes someone would mutter that the river crossing should have been here, or that the forest line seemed farther inland than marked. The boy kept his distance, but he listened with the sharpness of someone who had learned early that information was a currency long before money stopped being useful. A captain finally called for anyone who recognized the area. The refugees looked at the ground, shoelaces, dirt, stray pebbles, anything that wouldn't answer the question. The boy waited until the captain turned away, then stepped forward and pointed not at the road, but toward the ridge silhouetted against the clouds. It was the kind of gesture that didn't belong to someone his age, something too certain, too practiced. The captain stared at him, perhaps expecting a sentence that would betray childish doubt, but the boy only said that the ridge split into two paths behind the treeline and that the left one led to the marshes. The right would take them to the bridge. The captain didn't ask how he knew. War rarely had time for curiosity. Instead, he sent a corporal with 2 scouts to confirm it. They returned 20 minutes later and didn't bother hiding their surprise. The boy said nothing, but inside he felt a small heat of vindication, not pride exactly, but the confirmation that he wasn't imagining things when he believed the world could be read like a set of measurements. The column moved again, but the refugees moved slower than the trucks. They passed the marshes to their left, glistening like oil under the fading light. Someone behind him whispered that artillery shells sank there just as quickly as boots, and for a moment he pictured enemy columns bogged down in black water, turning back in confusion. The idea came and went like a spark, too small to be a plan yet, but not small enough to forget. That night the captain summoned him, not through official channels, not with rank or formality, but with the tired gesture of someone calling for a lamp to be brought closer. The boy stood at the table while the officers argued over how much fuel they had left, how many kilometers of road could be defended, how many hours the enemy needed to regroup. When the argument stalled, the captain looked at him and asked what he knew of the road to the east. The officers laughed at first, quiet, strained, not mocking but incredulous. The boy ignored them and traced with his finger an invisible line across the tabletop, describing how the forest broke into clearings, how the ground dipped into a ravine, how a narrow strip of farmland led to the hills where the roads intersected like veins. He spoke without hesitation, as if reciting something already memorized. When he finished, the laughter didn't return. The captain rolled out a map, creased, dirt-stained, outdated by years, and for the first time the boy saw that the officer's world was smaller than his, limited to the paper in front of them. It was then that the idea began to take shape, not fully, not even consciously, but in the gap between what the map claimed and what the land actually offered. Roads that existed only in memory, bridges rebuilt by farmers without permits, trails worn by cattle and children but never logged by the military. These were pieces of geography that did not belong to official strategy. And in war, what wasn't official could be exploited. When the meeting ended, the captain told him to sleep near the trucks instead of with the refugees. It was not a kindness, it was a measure of utility, like storing ammunition close at hand. But the boy understood that too. He curled near a wooden crate and stared at the wheels until exhaustion finally claimed him. The trucks bore no markings, yet he could identify their purpose from the smell: diesel for transport, resin for repairs, and the faint trace of cordite from crates that weren't meant for refugees. Before dawn, engines coughed awake, and the column prepared to move again. The boy swallowed a mouthful of cold water and watched as soldiers checked their rifles with emotion that had become almost ritual. No one spoke of what lay behind them anymore. Retreat had transformed into maneuver, and maneuver carried the illusion of choice. By midday, they reached the crossroads. It was nothing more than a widening in the road where three paths diverged, but in the logic of war such places acquired weight. Officers debated which route would hold longer, which terrain favored defense, which direction the enemy would expect. The boy observed quietly and noticed that no one considered the fourth option, the trail that didn't appear on their maps, the one that peeled off behind the orchard and curved through abandoned farmland before merging with the eastern ridge. It wasn't a road for armies, but it was a road for illusions. Boy waited until the officers' voices had risen in a temporary crescendo of frustration, then stepped forward. He did not speak first. Instead, he crouched near the edge of the orchard, tracing the curve of the hidden trail with his eyes, memorizing the way the sunlight dappled the ground through the bare branches. He could feel the texture of the path under his shoes even without touching it, compacted earth where carts had once passed, the faint imprint of a plow wheel, the hollow pockets left by stray animals. "Behind the orchard," he said finally, his voice low but carrying, "there's a path. It winds through the farmland and joins the ridge east of here. It's safer." For a moment, the soldiers did not respond. Then the captain leaned in, squinting, and tapped the map with a gloved finger. "Not here," he muttered, "not marked." The boy shrugged, as if to suggest that maps were never the final truth. He did not offer a reason, nor did he try to persuade. He only let the weight of certainty sit quietly between them. The officers exchanged glances, a subtle shift in their demeanor, part skepticism, part desperation. The corporal who had followed him yesterday nodded slightly. He had begun to understand that some knowledge could not be found on paper. The decision came slowly. The captain finally waved for two scouts to ride ahead and verify the trail. When they returned, their surprise mirrored that of the previous day. The path was narrow, tangled with the remnants of old hedgerows, but it was intact, dry in most places, and absent of the shell craters that scarred the main roads. The column diverted. Civilians murmured questions and concerns, but the officers silenced them with gestures, not words. The boy slipped to the edge of the group, keeping pace without being noticed. There was no triumph in this, only a quiet, deep satisfaction, the kind that comes from moving unseen, from knowing that the land itself bends to those who listen closely. By evening, the trail had carried them past the orchards, through fields that smelled faintly of rot and spring mud. A lone windmill on a ridge marked the horizon, its sails unmoving yet somehow alive in the fading light. The boy recognized the place instantly. It was a vantage point, a space where one could see approaching danger long before it arrived. He lingered there for a moment, scanning the far tree lines, counting shapes that might have been people, imagining shadows that might be soldiers. The captain joined him silently, not asking questions, only observing. It was an acknowledgement, the kind reserved for those whose value is evident but inexplicable. The boy felt the weight of it, heavier than any pack he had carried, heavier than the small canvas bag that now smelled faintly of dust and sweat. Night fell with a cold wind that bit through the columns' thin blankets and canvas covers. Fires were lit in small clusters, not enough to illuminate the path ahead, only enough to create pockets of warmth. The boy sat near one of these, tracing the edges of a map he had begun to draw himself, using memory, not ink. It was crude, incomplete, but it mattered less than the knowledge it represented. Each line, each fork, each ridge was a lifeline, a way forward when others had none. He slept fitfully, dreams filled with forked paths, the echo of distant engines, and the quiet rhythm of soldiers' boots. When he awoke, the sun was pale on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray and ochre. The column was stirring again, but the boy no longer felt like a passive observer. He had learned the language of roads and rivers, of hedgerows and marshes. He knew that in this war, maps were suggestions, not commandments, and that survival often belonged to those who read the land more carefully than the orders. The next fork came sooner than expected. Three paths converged beneath an old stone bridge, half collapsed, water running in shallow channels below. Soldiers debated loudly, compasses clinking, maps folding and unfolding like delicate insects. The boy stepped forward once more. He did not point this time. He walked, slow and deliberate, to the left of the group, toward the faintest impression of a track that led beneath the bridge, along the riverbank, and out to the ridge beyond. No one followed immediately, but when the scouts returned, nodding, the column adjusted its course. The boy stayed near the rear, hands in pockets, watching. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and diesel, of smoke and distant fires. He was small against the vast, uncertain countryside, but he had become something more than a boy fleeing. He was a guide, a quiet axis around which a retreating army now pivoted. And for the first time, he understood that maps could lie, but memory and the patience to read it rarely did. The morning was grey and restless. Mist clung to the low fields like a hesitant ghost, and every sound, the drip of water from a broken branch, the distant caw of a crow, felt magnified. The boy walked near the edge of the column, eyes scanning, ears straining. He no longer counted the hours or the kilometers. Time had become something elastic, stretching with uncertainty and snapping back with every decision made under duress. By midday, the scouts returned from a reconnaissance farther along the ridge. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with that sharp, anxious light that comes when someone glimpses danger before it fully arrives. They whispered to the captain, who gestured silently for the boy to step closer. "The road ahead," one scout said, voice trembling. "It's been cut. Trees, trenches, someone's expecting us." The boy knelt, tracing the imagined path with his finger. He had seen this kind of thing before, not on maps, but in memory, in the patterns of the land. The curve of the riverbank, the gaps in the hedgerow, the slope of the hills, all spoke of natural obstacles that could be made lethal with human intent. "They've anticipated the main paths," he said. "There's still a way. A smaller trail runs along the ridge, narrow, but it's clear of traps. It comes out near the farmhouse beyond the northern field." The captain did not ask how he knew. He had learned over the past 2 days that the boy's certainty was different from guesswork. It was grounded in the world itself, not the faded ink of maps. A few soldiers exchanged skeptical glances, but exhaustion and necessity won over hesitation. Orders were given. The column adjusted. As they moved, the boy noticed small changes. The scent of smoke drifting from beyond the next rise, footprints that did not belong to their group, and the faint but distinct sound of distant engines. Not trucks this time, something heavier. Panic rose quietly in the civilians behind them, though they spoke in whispers, and those whispers carried in the thin, cold air. By late afternoon, the boy led the scouts and a small contingent along the ridge trail. From this vantage, they could see the northern field and the farmhouse beyond it. Broken fences, mud paths, and scattered livestock suggested abandonment, yet the quiet was too deliberate. Every sound seemed amplified. Birds had stopped singing, even the wind held its breath. The boy motioned for silence. The soldiers followed, boots sinking into soft earth, rifles at the ready. He paused at a bend where the ridge narrowed, letting the column string out behind him. It was a precarious line of motion, fragile in the way a spider's web might be if touched too roughly. A wrong step, a loud word, and the advantage they had gained could vanish instantly. "Enemy patrols," a corporal whispered. "Maybe," the boy said, "or maybe just the ones who want us to think they are." He did not elaborate. He had learned that too much explanation invited doubt. Doubt could slow a retreat, and a slowed retreat could be deadly. The ridge stretched on, winding through scrub and patches of woodland. The boy noticed subtle signs, crushed leaves where someone had passed recently, the faint glimmer of metal in the underbrush. They were being watched. Someone, or more than one, knew they were coming. Dusk fell while they were still on the ridge. Shadows lengthened and the air chilled. The captain called a brief halt at a small clearing. Fires were forbidden, the light would betray them. The boy sat on a fallen log, knees drawn up, listening. The column murmured in low voices behind him. Civilians shivered. He did not. He was thinking ahead, always ahead, tracing the next bends of the ridge, the approaches to the farmhouse, imagining how it could be used as cover or trap. Maps could not show these things. Only knowledge born of long observation, of patience, and of memory mattered now. A sudden sound snapped him from his thoughts, a twig breaking, faint but distinct, coming from the forested slope to their left. The scouts raised their rifles instantly, eyes scanning the dimming light. The boy rose quietly, moving closer to the slope, straining to see through the darkness and mist. "Hold," he whispered, though no one needed to be told. Minutes passed, the mist thickened, shapes emerged, first indistinct, then more defined, figures moving in single file, cautious, deliberate. The boy counted them, noted their spacing, the way they held their weapons, and the small, irregular marks of boots in the mud. Not enough for a full engagement, but enough to know the threat was real. He turned to the captain. "We are visible," he said softly, "but they haven't realized how small this path is. We can slip past if we move slowly and don't make a sound." The captain nodded. He had begun to trust the boy more than any map, more than any officer's instinct. Orders were whispered. The column advanced, every step measured, every movement deliberate. Civilians followed, stepping where the boy had already walked, trusting a knowledge they could not see. And as the first stars appeared in the cold sky, the ridge carried them forward, past the watchers, past the broken fields, past the sense of inevitability that had clung to them since leaving the town. For the first time, the boy felt something he hadn't allowed himself. The faint, fragile possibility that they could reach beyond the shadow of fear, that memory and courage might bend the land in their favor. But in the distance, the echo of engines reminded him that safety was always temporary. War never slept. Night deepened over the ridge, and the cold pressed into their bones. The boy kept near the edge of the column, eyes fixed on the faint outline of the farmhouse ahead. Its silhouette was jagged against the horizon, roof slanted, walls pocked with holes from some long-forgotten storm, or perhaps something more deliberate. He did not know if it had been abandoned entirely, or if someone still waited inside, watching the road below. Either possibility demanded caution. The scouts ahead moved silently, rifles ready, scanning the treeline for movement. The boy followed their rhythm, stepping into footprints he had memorized, pressing his feet where the soil had been packed by others. Every sound, snap of twig, gust of wind, distant owl, was catalogued and ignored or considered, depending on its threat. He had grown accustomed to listening not for what was present, but for what was absent. Halfway to the farmhouse, the first warning came. A faint glimmer in the mist, movement too deliberate for deer, too coordinated for the wind. The boy froze, signaling with a raised hand. The column halted immediately, civilians muffling their coughs, soldiers adjusting their positions. "They're setting an ambush," he whispered. "Along the ridge below, near the north slope, traps in the mud, stakes hidden in grass, maybe explosives if they had the time." The captain, kneeling beside him, did not respond with words. He only nodded once, sharply. His eyes were fixed on the ridge below, where shadows moved like smoke. The boy's gaze followed the soldiers, and for the first time he noticed that the enemy was watching them through more than just instinct. They were waiting, expecting, and calculating. "Tell me the path," the captain said finally, voice low. The boy pointed, tracing a line through the orchard and along a faint trail that skirted the slope's edge. "It's narrow," he said. "We have to move single file, silently, step on stones, avoid mud puddles. Any noise will give them away. Follow me." The column adjusted. Civilians shuffled forward reluctantly, guided by hands on shoulders, whispered instructions, and the boy's quiet confidence. Each step was painstaking, each misstep potentially fatal. Yet the ridge seemed to bend in his favor. Small dips in the ground, old rabbit trails, clumps of heather, all forming a natural cover if one knew how to read them. Halfway along the hidden path, a gunshot rang out, sharp, sudden. Civilians screamed, ducking to the earth. The boy did not flinch. He knew it had been a warning, aimed to scatter or panic. He signaled the column to freeze. "Keep moving," he whispered to the captain. "They'll shoot again if we hesitate, but they can't cover this path without exposing themselves." The soldiers followed, careful, rifles raised but restrained. The boy led, counting steps, timing breaths, noting every shadow that might conceal a threat. The air was thick with fear and mist. It seemed to cling to their skin, suffocating in its persistence. Yet every careful step carried them further from the north slope, further from the ambush they had almost stumbled into. By the time the farmhouse came into full view, pale under the moonlight, the column had survived the trap without a single casualty. Civilians collapsed near the walls, exhausted and trembling. Soldiers surveyed the area, rifles sweeping for late threats, but the ridge behind them was silent now, empty except for the mist that curled and drifted like smoke. The boy finally allowed himself to breathe. He perched on the farmhouse steps, watching the dark shapes of the ridge they had just navigated. For the first time in days, the heat of fear in his chest eased slightly, replaced by a grim, hard-won satisfaction. The captain approached, eyes tired but sharp. "You saved us," he said simply. Not a praise, not a command, only acknowledgement. The boy nodded, saying nothing. Words had little value compared to this, the knowledge that the ridge had bent to his understanding, that memory and patience had outweighed firepower and maps. That night fires were lit sparingly inside the farmhouse. Civilians huddled around them, warmed but silent, as though exhaustion had stripped them of speech. Outside, the wind whispered over broken fields and twisted fences. The boy drew a crude map on a scrap of paper, marking paths, ridges, and safe passages. The soldiers watched him work without comment. They did not need to understand the lines. They only needed to trust them. And somewhere beyond the dark hills, engines waited. The enemy was regrouping, moving, calculating, and would not pause for the boy or the column. But for now, they had reached a temporary refuge, a sliver of control in a world that had been stripped of certainty. The ridge, the orchard, the hidden trail, each had been a small victory, a proof that even in retreat, knowledge could be a weapon more potent than fear. The boy closed his eyes on the farmhouse steps, listening to the wind, the faint drip of water from the eaves, and the distant murmur of the column resting. He did not sleep easily, or never allowed easy sleep, but he understood something vital now. In a world mapped by uncertainty, the smallest familiarity, the careful reading of earth, shadow, and sound, could bend survival toward those who remembered, who observed, who moved quietly through the chaos. Dawn broke thin and gray over the farmhouse. The boy had not slept. He sat on the steps, tracing the ridge with his eyes, listening to the faint crunch of soldiers checking their positions and civilians stirring in the cold. The wind carried distant sounds, trees snapping under weight, the low rumble of engines, the far-off bark of a dog startled by movement. The enemy was close. They could feel it. The scouts had returned at midnight with reports, patrols moving along the northern slope, sporadic gunfire echoing faintly in the valleys. It was only a matter of hours before pursuit began in earnest. The captain called the boy to him, spreading out the maps on the farmhouse table. He did not ask if the boy could read them. He already knew the answer. Instead, he leaned over the paper, pointing at the ridge, the orchard, the marsh beyond the northern fields. "You'll lead the column again," he said. Simple, direct, no praise, no explanation, only necessity. The boy nodded. He had long since stopped thinking of himself as a child or as one who merely followed. Here, on the edges of collapsing paths, he was a guide, not just of bodies, but of survival. They left before the sun had fully risen. Mist clung to the ground, and each step on the ridge required careful attention. The boy led, counting paces, knotting shadows, scanning for anything that deviated from memory. Every fork, every subtle undulation in the soil was a choice that could save lives. The enemy arrived soon enough, moving with mechanical precision, boots and engines in rhythm, firing sporadically to harass the column. But the boy's knowledge of the land turned danger into illusion. Every narrow trail, every hidden dip, every patch of reeds or trees became cover. Shots fell into mud, ricocheted harmlessly, or passed where no one stood. By midday, the column reached a wide river crossing, a bridge partially destroyed, shallow water pooling over jagged stones. The soldiers hesitated. Civilians froze. The boy stepped forward, eyes sweeping the crossing, fingers tracing invisible lines over broken timbers. "There's a way," he said. "Follow me. Stones here, fallen beam there, keep low. The current is stronger in the center." They moved carefully, stepping where he indicated. The bridge groaned but held, each step calculated. Beyond it lay open fields, but no ambush. The enemy had not anticipated this crossing, had not read the terrain as he had. Hours later, the column reached the safety of the eastern ridge. The farmhouse, the hidden trail, the bridge, each had been trials, each a test of observation, memory, and calm under pressure. Civilians huddled together, exhausted but alive. Soldiers lowered their rifles, fatigue and relief etched into their faces. The boy stood slightly apart, watching the horizon, listening to the wind. The captain approached once more, not with orders, but with acknowledgement. "You've kept us moving," he said, "kept us alive." The boy said nothing. Words felt inadequate. Survival, he understood, was not about recognition. It was about steps taken in silence, choices made in shadows, and the quiet knowledge of what lay hidden in the earth beneath one's feet. As night fell again, the ridge stretched endless and unbroken before them. The column rested, but the boy remained at the edge, tracing the paths they had traveled, already thinking of contingencies, of where to lead next if the enemy pressed. He was still 16, but the war had long since aged him beyond numbers. He had become something more, a navigator of uncertainty, a reader of land, a keeper of the fragile thread that separated survival from loss. And in that quiet moment, with engines rumbling faintly far behind and the stars beginning to pierce the darkness, he realized that maps could lie, plans could fail, and soldiers could falter, but memory, observation, and courage, these were the constants. The ridge was quiet now, but the boy knew it would never be still again, and he would be ready.